600 credits. That's what the Border Patrol officer told Rael Dashwood the smuggling fine would run him if he got caught giving a ride to an unregistered alien on Route 9, the old cargo highway that cuts through the dead salt flats between Prescott Station and the Kessler Ridge Depot. Rael didn't have 600 credits. He had a truck full of refrigerated pharmaceuticals, a busted air conditioner, and about 4 hours of daylight left before the desert turned into something that could kill a man twice over. He also had a body lying face down in the sand, 40 feet off the shoulder of the road, and something in him that wouldn't let him keep driving. That decision, made in about 11 seconds, on a stretch of asphalt that doesn't even have a name on most star charts, is the reason a princess of the Halcyon Compact is alive today. He didn't know that yet. He just saw someone who needed help, and he stopped. I need to tell you a little about Rael before I tell you about her, because none of this makes sense without him. He was 34 years old. He drove long-haul routes for Meridian Cold Chain, the kind of job where you spend 14 hours a day alone with a steering wheel and a radio that only picks up 2 stations out past the ridge, both of them playing the same 20 songs on rotation. He used to be a combat medic. Before that, a paramedic in a city nobody outside his home continent had ever heard of. He didn't talk about the medic years much. Not because there was some big dark secret, nothing so dramatic as that, just because most people who ask, "So what did you do before this?" don't actually want the real answer. They want a fun fact, and "I spent 3 years pulling people out of collapsed buildings and combat zones" tends to kill a conversation at a truck stop diner. So he told people he used to work in logistics, which was true in the driest, most technically accurate way a lie can be true. He was hauling a shipment of refrigerated insulin analogs out to the Kessler Ridge Colonial Hospital when he saw her. Just a shape at first, off to the side of the road, half buried in windblown salt, colored wrong for the landscape. Everything out on the flats was the color of bone and rust. She was blue-white, almost silver in the low sun, with a shimmer to her skin like oil on water. And for one confused second, he thought it was a downed weather drone, some kind of survey equipment that had crashed. Then the shape moved. Just barely. A hand, dragging itself 2 inches through the sand before giving up. He didn't remember deciding to brake. He remembered the truck already slowing, gravel popping under the tires, before his conscious mind had caught up with what his hands were doing. That's the medic training, I think. Some decisions get made below the part of the brain that argues with itself. He climbed down out of the cab into heat that hit like a wall. 109 degrees according to the display on his dash, the kind of dry heat that pulls the moisture out of your eyes before you've walked 20 feet. He crossed the shoulder, slid down the shallow embankment, and got his first real look at her. She was alien. That much was obvious immediately, and later he'd be embarrassed about how long it took him to fully process that fact, because in the moment it just didn't seem like the most important detail. She was tall. Taller than him lying down, which meant standing she'd have had 4 or 5 inches on his 6-foot frame. Her proportions were subtly wrong in the way that made his eyes want to slide off her, longer limb joints in places that didn't quite match up with human anatomy, and that strange opalescent skin that seemed to shift color slightly depending on the angle he looked at her from. Blue, then silver, then for a second almost violet. She was wearing what was left of a jumpsuit, gray, utilitarian, torn at one shoulder, streaked with dried blood the color of dark honey. No insignia, no jewelry, no obvious markers of status. Just someone in bad shape, alone in a desert that had no business having anyone alone in it. Her breathing was shallow and wrong too fast, rattling faintly on the inhale. Heat stroke, his brain supplied immediately, running through the old checklist without being asked. Dehydration. Possible internal injury, given the blood. He didn't know her biology. He didn't know if the things that would kill a human would kill her the same way, or if giving her water might actively hurt her, or if her body temperature regulation worked anything like his. He didn't know if she was dangerous. He didn't know if this was some kind of trap, though even as the thought crossed his mind it felt stupid, because nobody sets a trap by nearly dying of exposure in the middle of nowhere. What he did know was that a person, and he was already thinking of her as a person, not an alien, not an it, not a specimen, a person, was going to die in the next hour if nobody did anything. And he was the only anybody for 60 miles in any direction. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He went back to basics: airway, breathing, circulation. He got down in the sand next to her, careful of her neck in case of spinal injury, and gently rolled her onto her side to check her airway. She made a small sound, somewhere between a groan and a word in a language he didn't recognize. 3 syllables that rose at the end like a question. Her eyes opened for just a second, pale gold, unfocused, terrified, and then slid shut again. "Hey," he said, "because that's what you say, even to someone who can't understand you, even to someone from a different solar system, because the sound of a calm voice does something for a person in shock that words alone can't. Hey, I've got you. You're okay. I've got you." He ran back to the truck for his water. Not the sealed pharmaceutical cargo, obviously, but his own personal supply, 4-gallon jugs. He kept behind the driver's seat because you don't drive Route 9 without backup water. That's basic desert sense, the kind of thing that gets drilled into you the first month you work this route, or you don't make it to the second month. He grabbed 2 jugs and a rag and ran back. He wet the rag first and pressed it to the back of her neck, to her wrists, to the pulse points, the fastest way to bring a core temperature down without shocking the system. Then carefully he tilted her head and let a thin trickle of water touch her lips. Well, not pouring it in, because an unconscious or semi-conscious person can aspirate water into their lungs, and if her respiratory system worked anything like a human's, that would kill her faster than the dehydration would. She swallowed. Weakly, but she swallowed, and something in his chest unclenched that he hadn't realized was clenched. He kept at it for almost 20 minutes, small amounts, patient, watching her breathing, watching her color, if color was even the right framework for whatever was happening under that shifting, opalescent skin. At some point her eyes opened again, and stayed open, tracking him, wide, with something that might have been fear, or might have just been the disorientation of waking up in a stranger's hands in the middle of an alien desert. "It's okay," he said again, keeping his voice low and even, the voice you use on scared animals and scared people, which are more similar than most folks think. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe. Water. Here." He held up the jug so she could see it, made the drinking motion exaggerated and slow, hoping gesture would do what language couldn't. She stared at him for a long moment. Then, so faintly, he almost missed it, she nodded. He got maybe half a liter into her over the next hour, along with enough shade that her breathing started to even out. The sun was dropping fast by then, the temperature swinging the way it does on the flats, from murderous heat to a cold that could be just as dangerous once night fully set in. He made a decision he'd spend the next several days quietly terrified about, legally speaking. He picked her up, which was harder than it sounds because she was taller than him, and her frame, while lighter than a human of the same height, was not exactly light, and got her into the cab of his truck. He gave her his coat. It was an old canvas thing, lined, the kind of coat that had survived 4 winters of highway runs and smelled like motor oil and coffee, and he draped it over her, because the temperature was already dropping, and her jumpsuit was torn and she was shivering despite the heat still radiating up off the asphalt. She looked at the coat, then at him, with an expression he couldn't read on an alien face. But that felt unmistakably like confusion, like she hadn't expected it, like the gesture itself didn't compute. He'd think about that expression a lot, later. At the time, he just figured she was disoriented. It would be a while before he understood that he'd just done something for her, that, as far as she knew, nobody in her entire life had ever done before. Not like that, not for nothing. He called it in, of course. First to his dispatcher, who told him in no uncertain terms that picking up an unregistered alien national was a violation of at least 4 different transit codes, and he'd be lucky if it was only a fine. Then, because his conscience wouldn't let it go, to the small regional med station out past Kessler Ridge, a 2-room clinic that mostly handled dehydration cases and the occasional mining injury, staffed by a woman named Dr. Cray, Mara Voss, who had over 15 years out on the flats. developed a professional habit of not asking too many questions about how patients arrived on her doorstep. "She's alien," Rael told her over the radio, driving one-handed, glancing over every few seconds at the woman now half-conscious and wrapped in his coat in the passenger seat. "I don't know this species. Tall, blue-silver skin, some kind of shift to the color, dehydrated bad, and there's blood. I don't know if it's hers or someone else's. There's no obvious wound, but the jumpsuit's soaked through at the shoulder." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that he thought the connection had dropped. "Bring her in," Voss said finally. "I'll figure it out when she's in front of me." It took another 40 minutes to reach the clinic, 40 minutes during which the alien woman drifted in and out, occasionally murmuring words in that language he didn't recognize, occasionally gripping the edge of the seat when the truck hit a rough patch of road, and once, disconcertingly, reaching out and closing her long fingers around his forearm. Just for a second, just enough pressure to register as deliberate rather than a spasm. He glanced over. Her eyes were open, gold and exhausted, fixed on him. "Thank you," she said, in English. Accented. Strange. The vowels stretched, slightly wrong, but unmistakably, clearly English. He nearly put the truck in the ditch. "You speak English," he said, which was not the smartest thing he'd ever said, but was the only thing that came out. "Translator," she said, and touched a small, dull patch behind her ear. He hadn't noticed before, half covered by her hair, some kind of embedded device. "Damaged. Working now. A little." "Okay," he said. "Okay. What's your name?" She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he thought maybe the device had stopped working again, or maybe she just didn't want to answer. "Sela," she said finally. It wasn't her real name. He'd learn that later. But it was the name she gave him, in the cab of a refrigerated pharmaceutical truck on a dead highway, in the dark, and for the next several hours it was the only name he had for her. Dr. Bruss. Voss took one look at Sela when they carried her into the clinic, and went into the kind of focused, wordless efficiency that 15 years of frontier medicine builds into a person. She didn't ask what species. She didn't ask where Sela had come from or how she'd ended up half buried in the salt flats, 40 miles from anything. She just started working, running her scanner over unfamiliar alien vitals and cross-referencing them against the sparse, open-source alien physiology database the clinic kept for exactly this kind of situation, rare as it was. "Dehydration's severe but treatable," she said, about 20 minutes in, snapping off a pair of gloves. "The blood isn't hers, at least not from a wound I can find. I think she got it from someone else. Whatever happened to her, happened to more than just her." Rael stood in the corner of the small treatment room, arms crossed, because there was nothing else useful for him to do, and he found he didn't want to leave. He told himself it was just making sure she was okay, professional courtesy, the same instinct that used to keep him at a scene until the ambulance actually pulled away. He didn't examine too closely why it felt like more than that. "She say anything about what happened?" Voss asked, not looking up from the readout. "Not much," she said. "Thank you. That's about it." Voss glanced at him. "You gave her your coat." "Yeah. And your water." "Yeah." "You know, there's supposed to be a protocol for unregistered alien contact, right? You're supposed to call it in to the regional consulate, not drive her across 2 counties in your cargo truck." "I called it in," Rael said. "I called you." "That's not the protocol, Rael. She was dying, Amara." Voss looked at him for a second, then sighed, the particular sigh of a woman who has had this exact argument with this exact man before, about other things, and always loses. "Yeah," she said. "I know. I'm not saying you did the wrong thing. I'm saying somebody's probably looking for her, and when they find out how she ended up alive, it's not going to be a quiet conversation. She was right, of course. Somebody was looking for her. Somebody had been looking for her for 11 days. Now I want to step back here for a second and tell you what was actually happening, because Rael didn't know any of this yet. And it's worth understanding just how far the gap was between what he thought he'd found on the side of the road. Sela's real name was Elivankes Solarin, and she was the second daughter of the reigning monarch of the Halcyon Compact, a coalition of 11 core systems and 40-some client worlds that had existed in one form or another for almost 900 years. The Compact was not a small polity. It was not a backwater. It was one of the oldest continuous political structures in this arm of the galaxy, older than most of the empires that like to look down their noses at it for being merely a compact rather than a proper empire. And its royal guard, the Salmet Vanguard, was considered one of the most rigorously trained and equipped security forces in known space. Losing a princess of the compact was not a minor diplomatic embarrassment. It was closer to a planetary-scale crisis. 11 days earlier, Eleven had been traveling incognito, which was something she did more often than her father's Security Council was comfortable with, on a diplomatic transport, making a quiet, low-profile stop at a neutral trade station on the edge of compact space, part of a personal project she'd been running for 2 years involving direct, and non-official outreach to smaller, non-aligned worlds who didn't have the political weight to get proper compact attention through normal channels. She believed, and had argued for years, that the compact spent too much time talking to powers and not enough time talking to people, and that some of the worst decisions in the compact's history had come from a court that only ever heard from other courts. Her transport had been ambushed, not by pirates, not randomly, but by a hired paramilitary group working for a mining cartel that had a very specific grudge against her outreach program, because one of the small, non-aligned worlds she'd been quietly courting happened to sit on top of a resource deposit the cartel had spent 6 years trying to seize through less legitimate channels. And her diplomatic attention was making that a great deal harder. The ambush had been thorough. Her security detail, 4 Vanguard officers, had fought and died buying her time to reach an escape pod. The pod's navigation had been damaged in the fighting and had brought her down hard, hundreds of miles off any inhabited settlement, on a planet that, as far as the cartel's intelligence had told them, was an obscure, low-priority, technologically middling human colony world that nobody with any actual power paid attention to. They weren't wrong about the planet being low priority. That was, in fact, sort of the point. The cartel's assumption, and I want you to sit with this assumption for a second because it's the whole engine of what happens next, was that if their attack succeeded in stranding her, she would either die quietly in the desert of an unremarkable resource-poor human frontier world before anyone found her, or, in the unlikely event she was found she'd be found by exactly the kind of people the cartel expected to inhabit a backwater like this: indifferent, self-interested, easily bribed or intimidated, people who would see an injured alien and think first about what they could get out of the situation rather than what the situation demanded of them. They had run the numbers, in other words, the same way galactic institutions in stories like this one always seem to run the numbers, and concluded that humans, isolated, poorly resourced, technologically unremarkable humans, on the specific unremarkable stretch of unremarkable desert where her pod went down, represented close to zero risk of interference. They had not accounted for Rael Dashwood. They had not accounted for the fact that this particular unremarkable human had spent 3 years as a combat medic pulling strangers out of the worst days of their lives for no reason other than it was what needed doing. And that the years since hadn't changed that in him even slightly. They just moved the venue from disaster zones to an empty highway. They had not accounted for a species that, as a rule, does not calculate the political value of a stranger before deciding whether they're worth saving. The Vanguard search had been running continuously since the ambush, first combing the wreckage of the transport, then widening outward in the brutal, grinding, systematic way that a well-funded search and rescue operation does when the person missing is worth an entire fleet's worth of resources. They'd found the escape pod on day 9, a burned-out husk, half swallowed by sand, no body inside, which had been simultaneously the best and worst possible news because it meant she might be alive, and it also meant she'd been exposed to that environment, unprotected, for over a week. The commander of the search element was a woman named Threll Cade Ambrose, first blade of the Salmet Vanguard, 61 years old by her species reckoning, which put her somewhere in late middle age, a career soldier who had personally trained 3 generations of Vanguard officers and who had, not incidentally, known Eleven since the princess was a small child, having served as her personal protection detail for almost a decade before her promotion to command. This was not for Threll an abstract mission. This was a 9-day nightmare in which she had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch, had grounded and personally reviewed every scrap of sensor data from 3 orbital platforms, and had begun in the last 48 hours to privately accept the strong likelihood that she was searching for a body. On the morning of day 11, one of her junior officers flagged an anomaly. A local human medical clinic on the very edge of the search radius had logged an emergency alien contact case the previous evening. Species markers in the intake log, hastily filed by an overworked frontier doctor who didn't have time for bureaucratic niceties, matched close enough to warrant immediate investigation. Rael didn't wait for confirmation. She took 2 shuttles and 6 of her remaining vanguard, the survivors of the original 8-person detail, plus reinforcements who'd arrived after the ambush, and burned atmosphere getting to the coordinates. Which brings us to dawn, and to the moment the story is actually named for. Rael had stayed at the clinic overnight, which he told himself, and told Amara Voss, and told the small, persistent voice of professional detachment that used to run his life, was purely because he wanted to make sure his cargo, still sitting in the truck's refrigerated hold, didn't spoil, and because it was too late to safely drive the rest of the route to Kessler Ridge. In the dark, Amara had raised an eyebrow at this explanation and said nothing, which was somehow worse than if she'd argued the truth. If he was honest with himself, which he generally tried to be even when it was inconvenient, was that he didn't want to leave until he knew Sela was going to be okay. She'd been stabilized by midnight, hydration levels climbing back into a range Amara's alien physiology database labeled cautiously survivable, her breathing evened out, color, whatever color meant on that shifting opalescent skin, improved. She'd slept for a while, and sometime around 4 in the morning, she'd woken up and found Rael still sitting in the plastic chair in the corner of the room, half asleep himself, his coat still draped over her, and she'd asked, in that halting translator-assisted English, why he hadn't left. "Didn't want you to wake up alone in a strange place," he'd said, which was true. And also, he realized as he said it, sounded a little more tender than he'd meant it to. She'd looked at him for a long moment. "You do not know what I am," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "You're someone who almost died in the desert," he said. "That's what I know. That's kind of all I needed to know." "That is not how it usually works," she said quietly. Like she was telling him something important. Something that had cost her more than the words themselves suggested. "Where I am from. Kindness is transactional, even among my own people. There is always a cost, always a return expected." Rael thought about that for a second. "Where I'm from, sometimes people just help each other because somebody needs help. Doesn't have to be complicated." "That sounds," she said, "very naive." "Probably," he agreed. "Works out fine most days, though." She'd almost smiled at that. He was fairly sure it was a smile. Anyway, translated across an alien face that didn't quite move the way a human one did. And then, because the universe apparently runs on a very particular sense of narrative timing, that was the exact moment the front door of the clinic blew off its hinges. Not literally, I should say, before you picture something more violent than what actually happened. It was a controlled breach, precise, fast, the kind of entry that trained security professionals execute when time matters more than subtlety, but it still sounded. From inside a 2-room frontier clinic at 4 in the morning, like the end of the world. Rael was on his feet before he consciously decided to move, putting himself between the door and the bed without thinking about it, which is, again, the kind of decision that gets made below the part of the brain that argues. Amara Voss came out of the back room in her sleep clothes, with a look on her face that suggested she was already composing the incident report in her head. And through the blown door came 6 figures in dark articulated armor, tall, moving with a fluid economy of motion that made Rael's stomach drop, because he'd been around enough soldiers in his life to recognize that particular quality of movement, the quality that says these people have killed before and will again without much internal debate about it. At the front was a woman, tall even by the standard of her own apparently tall species, her armor scarred in places that suggested real use rather than ceremony. Her face, visible through a raised visor, set in an expression of controlled, Disgusted intensity that Rael would later understand was the face of someone who had not allowed herself to hope in 9 days and was, in this exact second, being forced to hope anyway. Her eyes went past Rael, past Amara. Locked on the bed. "I leavin'," she said. And her voice cracked on the word, just slightly, just enough that Rael understood, even without knowing anything about who these people were, that whatever this was, it was not a routine recovery operation. This was personal. The woman on the bed, Sela, sat up slowly, the coat sliding off her shoulders, and said something in a language Rael didn't understand. 3 syllables, rising at the end, the same sound she'd made when he first found her in the sand, except this time her voice was strong, and this time it was clearly, unmistakably, a name. The armored woman crossed the room in about 4 strides and dropped to one knee at the bedside, which struck Rael as an odd thing for a heavily armed soldier to do in the middle of what still looked, from his vantage point, uncomfortably like a hostage situation, until he understood that it wasn't procedure, it was relief. It was a woman who had spent 9 days preparing herself to find a body finding, instead a living person, and the knee wasn't a formality, it was because her legs weren't entirely steady. "We thought," Threll said, and stopped, and started again. "We found the pod burned, we thought." "I know," Illivan said, and reached out and gripped the other woman's armor gauntlet with both hands. "I know what you thought. I am sorry." There was no way to signal. The pod's transmitter died on impact. "How?" Threll said, and her eyes were already moving, cataloging the professional part of her brain, reasserting itself even through the emotion, scanning the readouts on the medical equipment, the IV line, the state of her princess's injuries, already half-healed, already stabilized. "Twat, in a way that 11 days alone, in a hostile desert, should not have allowed for. How are you alive? You should not be alive. Our projections gave you perhaps 30 hours of survival time on that terrain without shelter or water. And that was optimistic." Eileen turned her head and looked at Rael, still standing there in the corner in his undershirt and work pants holding his coat, which she'd handed back to him at some point during the exchange, looking. He was uncomfortably aware, like a man who had wandered into the wrong story. "Him," she said. Every visor in the room turned toward him at once, and Rael had the distinct full-body experience of understanding what it feels like to be a small animal that has just realized 6 much larger animals are all looking at it with sudden focused interest. "He found me," Eileen said, still in English, apparently for Rael's benefit as much as anyone's. "On the road, he gave me water. He gave me his coat. He carried me to shelter and stayed with me through the night to make sure I did not wake up alone." There was a silence in the room that Rael would later describe when he tried to explain this whole experience to people who didn't believe him, as the loudest silence he'd ever heard in his life. Threll rose from her kneeling position slowly and turned to face him fully, and Rael became abruptly, uncomfortably aware of every weapon visible on her armor, and several he suspected weren't visible. "You are the one who found her," she said. It wasn't really a question, but it had the cadence of one, the cadence of someone double-checking a fact that seemed too important to leave to assumption. "Yeah," Rael said. His voice came out steadier than he felt, which he was grateful for. "Found her off the side of Route 9. She was in bad shape. Brought her here. You are a medical professional." "Used to be. Combat medic. A while back. Drive a truck now." Threll's expression did something complicated, something that moved through several states too fast for Rael to track, before settling into something he could only describe as deeply focused reassessment. "You knew," she said slowly, "that assisting an unregistered alien national carries legal and financial penalty under your world's transit codes. I heard that mentioned." "Yeah, and you did it anyway." "She was dying," Rael said, and he heard the same note of stubborn simplicity in his own voice that he'd used on Amara Voss hours earlier, the note of a man who genuinely did not understand why this required so much explanation. "I don't really see what else there was to think about." Something happened in the room then that Rael didn't fully understand until much later when Illivan explained it to him properly. All 6 of the armored vanguard, Threll included, went to one knee, not toward the princess, toward him. "What are you doing?" Rael said, alarmed, taking an involuntary step back, which put him against the wall, which meant there wasn't really anywhere further back to go. "It is customary," Threll said from her kneeling position, her voice rough, in a way that suggested this was costing her something to say, "to render honor to one who preserves the life of the compact line. It has been performed perhaps 4 times in the last 2 centuries. I did not expect to perform it today. I certainly did not expect to perform it for a human on a human world. I was told, in my own briefing materials, was of no strategic significance whatsoever." "I really think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," Rael said, looking to Eleven for help, because this had escalated well past the point where he had any idea how to navigate it. "Ma'am, princess, I just gave her some water. Anybody would have done that." "No," Eleven said quietly, and there was something in her voice, some old, tired weight, that made Rael stop talking. "That is exactly what would not have happened. Not where I come from. Not on most worlds I have visited. Do you understand what I told you last night? Kindness, where I am from, carries a price. Always. I have been the object of a great deal of what is called generosity in my life, and nearly all of it came with a ledger attached, a favor to be called then, an alliance to be leveraged, a debt I was expected to eventually repay in political capital. I did not know, until last night, what it was to receive help from someone who wanted nothing from me at all. I still do not fully believe it. I keep waiting for the invoice." "There's no invoice," Rael said. That's not how this works." "I'm beginning to understand that," Eleven said. "It is a strange thing to learn, at my age, from a stranger on the side of a road." Amara Voss, who had been standing quietly by the door through all of this with the expression of a woman watching a very high-stakes soap opera unfold in her own clinic, cleared her throat. "Not to interrupt whatever this is," she said, "but she's still recovering, and I'd strongly recommend against 6 people in full tactical armor crowding a dehydration patient's bedside for the next little while. Also, somebody owes me for a door." That got, unexpectedly, a short bark of laughter from Threll, the tension in the room breaking just slightly. "The compact will cover the door," she said. "The compact will cover considerably more than the door, and that, as it turned out, was something of an understatement. But over the next several hours, as word moved up the Vanguard's chain of command, and then, faster than Rael would have believed possible, up through several layers of compact diplomatic infrastructure, the full shape of what had happened started to become clear, not just to Rael, but to the wider apparatus of a 900-year-old interstellar polity that was, in its own way, just as capable of underestimating a stranger as any cartel or council chamber. The initial diplomatic dispatches, the ones drafted in the first frantic hours after Eleven's rescue, were written with a certain formal, careful blandness, the kind of language institutions default to when they don't yet know how a story is going to be received. A member of the royal line was recovered alive, following a period of extended exposure on a frontier human colony world, with credit for her survival attributed to intervention by a local civilian. It read. Threll told Rael later with some embarrassment, almost exactly like a report about a lost pet being found by a helpful neighbor. Bland, diminishing, utterly inadequate to what had actually happened. It took less than a day for that framing to collapse entirely, because Eileven herself refused to let it stand. She insisted, over the strenuous objections of at least 2 senior members of her father's diplomatic staff, who felt the matter should be handled quietly and without excessive public attention to the embarrassing fact that a princess of the Compact had nearly died of exposure on a backwater colony world, on giving a full account, on the record, broadcast through official Compact channels, of exactly what had happened and exactly who had made the difference. "I was told," she said, in a recorded statement that would eventually be viewed by something like 400 million people across Compact space, that the world I crashed on was of minimal strategic and cultural significance. I was told this in an official threat assessment prepared before my outreach mission, a routine document, the kind nobody reads carefully because nobody expects it to matter. It described the dominant species as physically unremarkable, technologically behind the median for spacefaring civilizations, and socially fragmented in ways that limited their capacity for organized action. I want to address that assessment directly because I believe it was not merely inaccurate. I believe it was dangerously, catastrophically incomplete. She went on to describe, in detail, plain and unadorned, exactly what Rael had done. The stopping on an empty highway with no obligation to do so. The water. The coat. The night spent in a plastic chair in a two-room clinic, not because policy required it, not because there was payment attached, but because a stranger did not want another stranger to wake up alone and afraid in an unfamiliar place. "I have been protected my entire life," she said, "by some of the finest trained soldiers in the compact, and I do not diminish that protection. It has been the foundation of my safety since before I could walk. But I have never, in 31 years, experienced protection, freely given by someone with absolutely nothing to gain from giving it. I did not know that experience existed. I am ashamed to admit that. I am the daughter of a 900-year-old political order built on treaties, alliances, and carefully calculated reciprocal obligation, and it took a truck driver on an empty desert highway on a world, my own government, considered beneath serious attention to teach me that some people simply choose to be decent, with no accounting kept. This did not go over quietly. I want to be clear about that. This wasn't a nice, tidy diplomatic footnote that everyone nodded along to and forgot within a news cycle. It detonated across several tiers of compact political and academic discourse simultaneously, because it directly and publicly contradicted an official, if low-priority threat and capability assessment, and institutions, whatever species runs them, tend to get prickly and defensive when a member of their own royal family stands up and says, on the record, that the assessment was not just wrong but embarrassingly, dangerously wrong. There were, predictably, attempts to manage the narrative. A junior analyst in the Compact's Exterior Intelligence Division, the poor soul who had actually authored the original threat assessment on the human colony world in question, found himself the subject of an unpleasant amount of scrutiny, though to his credit, when interviewed, he pointed out, accurately, that his assessment had been based on the very limited economic and military data available on a colony that had deliberately kept a low profile and had no formal diplomatic relations with the Compact at all. It wasn't that he'd assessed humanity and gotten it wrong. It was that nobody had really assessed humanity properly at all, because humanity, or at least this particular human colony, had never been important enough in the Compact's estimation to warrant the attention. Which was, if you think about it, exactly the problem, and exactly the point Illivan kept hammering on in interview after interview, statement after statement, over the following weeks. The Compact's institutional blind spot wasn't a mistake about humans specifically. It was a structural mistake about how the Compact decided which worlds were worth understanding at all, a bias toward measuring strategic value in resources and military capacity and trade volume, and a corresponding blindness toward the kind of quiet, distributed decency that doesn't show up on any economic index, but that, as she'd learned firsthand, could mean the difference between a princess dying alone in the sand and a princess going home. Rael, for his part, spent most of this period in a state of low-grade, ongoing bewilderment that he never fully shook. The first sign that his life had permanently and irreversibly changed came about 36 hours after the Vanguard's arrival at the clinic, when a compact diplomatic shuttle, sleek and silent, and entirely too large for the tiny gravel landing strip behind Amaravas's clinic, touched down and disgorged a delegation whose sole purpose, as far as Rael could tell, was to formally and repeatedly thank him. "I really don't need all this," he told Illivan, on the second day, gesturing vaguely at the shuttle, at the small crowd of Compact officials who had started arriving to conduct what they kept calling preliminary assessments of the situation, at the increasingly absurd volume of formal correspondence that had begun accumulating on the small tablet someone had given him because his personal comm unit apparently wasn't secure enough for Compact diplomatic traffic. "I gave a woman some water. I feel like the response is a little disproportionate to the water." "It was not the water," Illivan said. She was sitting up now, mostly recovered, color back to a steady, healthy shimmer that Amaravas had assured him was, for her species, the alien equivalent of rosy cheeks. "It was never about the water, Rael. It was that you gave it without knowing who I was, without any expectation of what it might be worth to you, and you would have given it exactly the same way if I had turned out to be nobody at all. That is a rarer thing than you understand. I have met kings who would not have stopped their vehicle for a stranger on the side of the road without first calculating the political optics of doing so. That's depressing, Rael said. It is the world I come from, Eileen said, and there was something tired and old in the way she said it, a weight that made him understand more than any of the formal diplomatic language had managed to. Exactly how strange and precious his 11 seconds of unthinking decision had actually been to her. I do not say that to make you feel burdened by it. I say it because I want you to understand why this matters as much as it does. To the compact, this is a diplomatic incident of some significance, a reassessment of assumptions, an embarrassment to be managed, and eventually spun into a lesson about the danger of underestimating unaligned worlds. That is the institutional version of this story, and it is not untrue, but it is not the important version. The important version is smaller. It is that I was dying, and a stranger who owed me nothing decided that did not matter, that a person needing help was simply a person needing help, and he acted on that before he had time to think of a reason not to. I have thought about that moment more in the last 2 days than I have thought about almost anything else in my adult life. Rael didn't really have a response to that. He sat with it for a while in the small clinic room that had, over the last 2 days, somehow become the center of a small but growing diplomatic incident, and eventually just said, "I'm glad you're okay." "I am aware," Eileen said, and this time the almost smile was unmistakable. "You have said that to me approximately 11 times since I woke up. It is possible you say it more than is strictly necessary." "Might be a medic thing," Rael admitted. "You get in the habit of checking." The formal diplomatic proceedings, once they got fully underway, were, from Rael's perspective, a genuinely surreal experience. The kind of thing that would have felt more at home in someone else's life story than his own. There was a formal, compact commendation ceremony conducted with more pageantry than Rael was entirely comfortable with, in which he was awarded something called the Threadless Bond, an honor, Threll explained to him with visible amusement at his discomfort, that had traditionally been reserved for acts of protection rendered with no reciprocal obligation attached, an honor so rarely given that the last recipient had died over 90 years earlier. "I want everyone to understand," Rael said, standing in front of a small crowd of compact officials, several journalists from at least 3 different species, and, somewhat bewilderingly, his own mother, who had been located and flown out at compact expense because apparently that was just how these things were done now, that I did not do anything special. I stopped a truck. I've been trained to help people who need it, and I saw someone who needed it, and I helped. If any of you had been driving that stretch of road and seen the same thing, I have to believe you'd have done the same." This turned out to be, according to essentially every subsequent piece of compact media coverage, the single most quoted sentence to come out of the entire incident, largely because it was regarded across several species and several political factions as almost unbelievably naive, and also, somehow, exactly the point. "He genuinely believes that," Threll said, in an interview conducted some weeks later, once the initial diplomatic frenzy had settled into something calmer. "That is what took me the longest to understand about him. He is not being modest for effect. He does not consider what he did remarkable, because in his framework, in the framework of the world he comes from, it is simply the baseline expectation of decent behavior. You help someone who needs help. That is the entire calculation. There is no second step where you weigh the political value of the person you are helping. I have spent 40 years of my life as a soldier of the Compact, sworn to protect the royal line at any cost to myself. And I did not fully understand, until I watched this man interact with the princess, that there is a kind of protection that exists entirely outside of duty, entirely outside of oath, entirely outside of any structure at all. He simply decided that a person dying in front of him was unacceptable, and acted on it, the way you or I might decide that. Stepping over a puddle is preferable to stepping in it. It cost him nothing to consider. It was not a decision at all in the way we understand decisions. It was closer to a reflex. That framing, a reflex, not a decision, became something of a talking point in the weeks that followed. As various compact analysts and academics scrambled to update their understanding not just of this particular human, but of humanity more broadly, and of frontier colony worlds more broadly still, there was, predictably, a flurry of academic papers, several documentary crews, at least one formal parliamentary inquiry into how a threat and capability assessment could have so thoroughly failed to capture something as significant as this, and less predictably, a noticeable uptick in compact diplomatic interest in establishing formal contact with the human colony government, an outcome that the mining cartel behind the original ambush had specifically and catastrophically not wanted. Which brings me, actually, to the fate of the people who started all this. The cartel that had orchestrated the ambush on Eleven's transport had, in the immediate aftermath, assumed their operation had either succeeded in the sense that she was dead, or at worst resulted in an unfortunate but manageable diplomatic mess involving a missing princess on an obscure human world nobody would look at too closely. What they got instead, once the full story came out, once Eleven's own testimony made clear that she had not merely survived, but survived, specifically because of the unexpected decency of the very population they'd assumed would be either useless or hostile, was a level of compact attention they had never in 1,000 years wanted. The investigation moved fast, once it had political momentum behind it. And political momentum in this case was substantial, because there is nothing quite like embarrassing an entire royal court's threat assessment apparatus to generate bureaucratic energy toward finding out exactly who was responsible. Within 6 weeks, the cartel's leadership had been identified, its assets frozen across 4 systems, and its senior officers extradited to face compact tribunal on charges that included, among a long list of others, the attempted assassination of a member of the royal line. Threll, I'm told, personally requested to be present at the tribunal, which was granted, and by all accounts she did not say a single word throughout the entire proceeding, which several observers found considerably more unsettling than if she had. But the more interesting long-term consequence, the one that actually matters for where this story ends up, wasn't the tribunal. It was the diplomatic reassessment. Eleven's colony world, the specific human settlement whose airspace Rael's little stretch of Route 9 happened to fall within, had existed for almost 60 years with essentially no formal compact diplomatic relationship at all. It was, in the dry language of compact bureaucracy, an unaligned frontier settlement of limited strategic interest which, in practice, meant it got almost no attention, almost no investment, almost no protection, and almost no consideration in any compact policy discussion, ever. It existed at the very bottom of a very long list of worlds the compact considered worth its time. Within 4 months of Eleven's rescue, that classification had changed entirely. Not because the colony's resources or military capacity had changed, they hadn't, not at all, but because the compact's own royal family had gone on record, repeatedly and pointedly, saying that the true value of a world could not be measured by resources or military capacity alone, that a population's character, its baseline instinct toward decency and mutual aid, mattered, and mattered more than most compact institutions had ever bothered to consider. The colony government, for its part, found this attention somewhat bewildering, given that it had spent 6 decades being politely ignored by the compact and was not entirely sure what to do with the sudden influx of diplomatic interest, trade proposals, and, memorably, an official state visit request from Eleven herself, who wanted, she said, to properly see the world that had produced the man who saved her life. Which brings us, finally, back to Rael, because I promised you an ending, and I intend to deliver one. He'd gone back to driving trucks within about 2 weeks of the whole ordeal, starting mostly because, as he told anyone who asked, and a great many people asked, he didn't really know how to be anything other than a truck driver, and the diplomatic circus, while flattering in a bewildering sort of way, wasn't really his speed. Meridian Cold Chain had, to their credit, given him a raise and quietly stopped mentioning the whole unregistered alien contact transit code violation, largely, he suspected, because the compact ambassador's office had made a few polite but pointed phone calls on his behalf that nobody in the regional transit authority wanted to have to explain to their superiors. He was back on Route 9, 6 months after that first night, hauling a load of agricultural equipment out toward the Kessler Ridge Cooperative, when a familiar shuttle set down on the gravel shoulder ahead of him, forcing him to slow the truck to a stop well before his exit. He climbed down, half expecting more diplomatic pageantry. Another commendation, another uncomfortable ceremony. He'd have to sit through with his hands folded and his collar too tight. What he got instead was a leave-in, dressed not in the formal state garments he'd seen in news coverage over the past 6 months, but in something plainer, practical, closer to what she'd have worn traveling incognito, standing at the base of the shuttle ramp with an expression that looked, for the first time since he'd known her, entirely unguarded. "You're supposed to call ahead," Rael said, by way of greeting, because he genuinely did not know how else to open this conversation. "This is a working highway. I've got a schedule." "I am aware," Eileen said. "I did, in fact, call ahead. Your dispatcher informed me you would be passing this exact point at this approximate time. I am told this counts as calling ahead in your particular professional culture. That's not really what I meant, but okay." She looked at him for a moment, the wind off the flats catching the loose fabric of her clothes, the same desert stretching out behind her that had nearly killed her half a year earlier. And there was something in her expression that Rael, who had spent years reading the faces of frightened, hurting people for a living, recognized immediately as someone working up to say something they'd been carrying for a while. "I wanted to tell you something," she said, "that I could not adequately say in any of the official statements, or the ceremonies, or the interviews, because none of those settings allow for the kind of honesty I actually mean. I have spent the last 6 months trying to explain to my own government, and to a great many other governments who have since taken an interest, exactly why what you did matters as much as it does. I have used words like reflex and instinct and baseline decency because those are the words that translate into policy language, into the kind of thing that shows up in a briefing document and changes a threat assessment. But I want to tell you the truth, which is smaller than all of that, and I think more important." Rael waited, leaning against the side of his truck, the engine still ticking as it cooled. "You are the first person in my entire life," Eileen said, "who held me before you knew what I was worth, not after. Not because you calculated I might be worth something later. Before. When I was nothing to you but a body in the sand that needed water, I have replayed that 11 times a day for 6 months. Trying to understand it, and I do not think I ever will. Fully. Because it does not exist in the world I come from. But I wanted you to know that it changed something. Not just in me. In the compact itself. In ways that are still unfolding. In ways I suspect neither of us will fully see the